Hello and welcome to another episode of Thick Slices and Deep Cuts. Today's episode will be the 12th and final installment of the Radio Giants series. And as you can hear, I'm going out with what I think is a bang. I'm going out with basically the biggest band to ever exist on planet Earth, and that is the Beatles. And again, I grew up on the Beatles, so all these bands that I've reviewed all year are bands not necessarily prog rock or extreme metal, but just bands that are rock based that I grew up on. The Beatles were certainly one of those. My dad listened to a ton of Beatles albums, and most of these albums I'll be showing you this evening are basically I just inherited from his collection when he wanted to get rid of his vinyls. So I've seen different things that say they have 13 proper albums, but there's one that they did for a movie that's not really an album. So in my opinion, and if we're going on the UK releases, because they had different releases for different countries, I'm going to say they had 12 releases. And I'm not going to rank them because it's pretty difficult. I will just say that at one point they get on a 6-album run that is pretty incredibly impressive. But I think I own maybe 7 of these, but what I don't own are the early years. So I'll get into that. Basically, they started out, a lot of people say that they existed from 62 to 70, and in many ways they did, but they actually started before that, and they had a different drummer than Ringo Starr. They had a guy named Pete Best, who apparently wasn't the best drummer in the world, but I'll put the picture up, and I think it's called the Complete Silver Beatles. So if you ever want to hear what they sounded like before Ringo in like 61 or I guess really early 62, they have all these tracks that I don't recognize the names of that he was on. But basically, they're in the studio. Apparently he wasn't good enough. Ringo was hanging around, and every time he jammed with them, it was a better take. So Ringo ended up in the band. First song they ever did that was a single, or a hit single anyway, with Ringo, and it came out in late 62, was called Love Me Do. So if you know that song, that was really the beginning of the Beatles, was that single. And then at some point in 63, they put out their first proper album called Please Please Me. And see, these early ones I don't have, so I'm going to go for my notes here, but that title track was a mild hit. Now, I Saw Her Standing There, which leads it off. I think it's a hit. It certainly reminded me of my childhood when I revisited some of these earlier albums. I'm like, oh yeah, I think my dad loved the early Beatles. I kind of prefer the latter on, but Twist and Shout. Paul McCartney's voice is shot, and that's what makes the song. I remember that song from being a kid, and then it was in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So that was the first album. Then later in that year, they're putting out like 2 albums a year with the Beatles. All My Lovin', Money, That's What I Want, It Won't Be Long, Wait a Minute, Mr. Postman. I think my dad liked that one because I don't know if it was necessarily a hit. Also, they would do these songs that were hits that weren't even on these albums, like She Loves You, Yeah, 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 and I Want to Hold Your Hand. These were singles that, as far as I can tell, weren't on either of these albums properly. Then probably their best early album would be A Hard Day's Night from 64. With that song, Can't Buy Me Love, a few others, and you can just tell they're just getting better every album. In the beginning, there was one also in 64 called Beatles for Sale. I don't think it's bad, but it wasn't quite as snappy, catchy as those early ones that were, rock and roll for sure, but had those hit songs. I don't think that really had any hit songs. But that was also in 64. So those first 4 albums were really just them writing those catchy tunes, which they always did. Then you move to 65, and I don't have this album, but after reviewing it heavily and being surprisingly familiar with it, just from being a kid and going, oh, that song was on that album, and vice versa. But in 65, you get to the album Help, which is really good, and you've got the song Help, you've got, She's Got a Ticket to Ride. Probably the coolest song they did in this early time was Yesterday. It's a really nice, well done song, a little bit of not orchestration, but just a little bit of strings there. So that's a good song. I may at some point get that album for sure. I might even get Hard Day's Night. It's pretty classic. And also, again, you've got these two songs from this session. I believe it's from this session. Maybe it's from the next album. Let's just say it's from 65. We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper. If you can see up there, Typo Negative and Mr. Peter Steele, they do a medley on World Coming Down, and it's mostly based around that song. That's a heavy song. Where did that song come from for the Beatles? It's like it's just one of those one-off songs that comes out of nowhere. So those are great. And also, I do have this from my dad's collection, this greatest hits, 62 to 66. So even though I don't have those early albums, I've got Love Me Do and a lot. She Loves You, Yeah, 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 I Want to Hold Your Hand, All My Love and Can't Buy Me Love, Hard Day's Night, 8 Days a Week, She's Got a Ticket to Ride, Yesterday, Help, We Can Work It Out, Day Tripper, and then so on and so forth. And but here's where I own the or have physical copies here, and this is for me where it really starts to kick off. I think it was already kicking off, but you've got Rubber Soul, late 65. Suddenly you're hearing like sitars, trippy little tricks in the studio that nobody had done up to this point. Maybe You Can Drive My Car, nice, by the time, it's 57 years ago. Norwegian Wood is great. Michelle, My Belle, that's a great one. Girl, In My Life, just a really cool, huge step up. In fact, I misspoke. I think We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper were during this recording session. And those songs are excellent too. So I just feel like, they started with these little pop hit songs. They were almost like a boy band or something, and they're getting these songs going on in 62, 63, and then 64 they're picking it up with A Hard Day's Night, Can't Buy Me Love. And then at 65 with Help, it's really starting to pick up. And here they're really taking off. And what a cool, iconic cover. Before John Lennon looked like Jesus. But he's getting there. But what a cool album. So Rubber Soul, this is the beginning of 6 albums in a row that are just absolutely classic. And we just finished listening to 3 songs from Revolver. And I got to tell you, I think this might be my favorite album of theirs. Daniel Gildenlow of Pain of Salvation called it their metal album. But my daughter and I, we love Taxman. That's a great song. Eleanor Rigby might be my favorite song they ever did. And Tomorrow Never Knows, we just finished listening to. What a trippy, weird song. Here, so this is them not quite in that second half of their career, but kind of setting the stage for what they were going to do from here on out. This was the last album that they toured for. It even has Yellow Submarine on there, which I loved as a little kid, when Ringo sings on the song, and it's got all those little sound effects, and I do like the song. For the longest time, I thought it was a corny song, but it's just so creative and imaginative, and these guys truly were the first progressive band. The things they were doing in the studios with studio tricks and trippy stuff and playing guitar analog, guitar tapes backwards over top of things as an overdub. Tomorrow Never Knows is just, to me, is like, wow, I didn't know you could do that with music in 66. Eleanor Rigby is just such a nicely crafted tune. It doesn't matter what year that was written. And this song, Paperback Writer, I found out they did put it on here, but I found out that it was recorded during this session. So, could you imagine if this album had Paperback Writer on it to go with everything else? What were some of the other... Tomorrow Never... Good Day Sunshine. Classic. Remember these apples? And then it's cut in half. Classic. Love You Too. Yellow Submarine, She Said, She Said. Yeah, just a classic album. Hair's getting long, but it's not totally long yet. But I guess I didn't know the 60s that well, and my ears aren't really trained for 60s music, so this was interesting for me to kind of hear it with a new perspective. Even though you know these songs, it's just, they come across in a different kind of way these days. But man, what an awesome album. I'm not ranking these today, but this is the second of 6 in a row that are just damn classics, and this might be my favorite one, Revolver from '66. And these are kind of a pair to me. They have a lot of pairs of albums. But in order to keep moving here, we'll just keep going. Good timing here. So, the tale of two halves of their career, 62 to 66. And I guess I'll flash it up here now. And then 67 to 70 would be the other half of their career. So they stop touring, they become studio rats, and they basically start making these inventive, as if the productions before weren't inventive. Now they're making these incredibly original, inventive concept albums, totally progressive. And we're listening to a deep cut from it just because I felt like if I played any of the super famous songs, it would just be like we're listening to the radio. You know, the title track, and with a little help from my friends, and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and A Day in the Life, which is totally iconic when you hear the opening. You know, I heard the news today, oh boy, and look at these guys. They're just coming out, they're ready to just conquer the world at this point. But I did put Fixing the Hole on here. I don't know, I like it. I just was looking for a deep cut, and I needed something from this album on the show. I'm trying to get stuff from Revolver for sure, something from this, something from the next one, and so on and so forth. But just what an incredibly well-recorded album. By the way, George Martin, their producer, sometimes known as the fifth Beatle, I believe he produced everything. Every major album he was involved in. So kudos to him for helping everybody make this come to fruition. But they basically just lived in the studio and crafted this concept album. The tracks, they do that crossfade where one track goes into the next. I don't know if that was really going on back then. And a lot of times, you know, we like to say that, you know, progressive music started in '67. And, you know, a lot of the modern music I listen to started in '67 with this album and Jimi Hendrix Are You Experienced. You kind of got the progressive creativity of the Beatles and then just the heavy, raw energy of Hendrix. But, you know, you can also say that, you know, Frank Zappa was in there in '66, and you can say Revolver and Rubber Soul and Help even were getting there too. So, but by '67, you know, you got the first Pink Floyd album, you got the Moody Blues are putting out their thing. So by '67, I feel like progressive rock has kind of definitely been born, for sure. And I think the Beatles were part of that. I definitely think they fit into that, especially at this point. But we'll just keep it moving here. And I don't know, is this their most successful album of all time? They have a ton. I think Revolver's huge. I think Rubber Soul's huge. I think this one, I've always thought this was their biggest album, but now I'm looking at the ones coming up, and maybe not. They just put out a zillion top-tier albums. Like 2 a year almost. And you hear something weird here. By the way, I always thought this was John Lennon singing. It's actually George Harrison. And his voice is somewhat similar to John's at times. But that's called Blue Jay Way. And that is from the next album, also in '67, Magical Mystery Tour. This may be my favorite album from them. And I didn't necessarily think that going into the review, and then I just started being honest about the tracks. I love Blue Jay Way. So weird. You know, Your Mother Should Know is catchy, kind of a deep cut. I think Blue Jay Way is kind of a deep cut. I Am the Walrus, incredible. It's a John Lennon one. So Blue Jay Way is a George Harrison one. By the way, he did the, again, I thought this was John Lennon. Sorry to go back to this one, but I forget the name of the song that's got all the trippy sitar stuff. Again, I thought that was John Lennon, and that's George Harrison too. Yeah, Within You, Without You. It's a trippy sitar-y one. I thought that was John Lennon all these years. And I typed in, I just wanted to see what all songs George Harrison sang on, because it doesn't seem like he's involved in a lot of the writing. Well, that's not exactly true. He's actually involved in quite a few songs. It's just that when you have 14 songs in an album, it looks like Lennon and McCartney write everything. But Harrison was giving you a couple of songs every album, it seemed. But Strawberry Fields, getting back to this one, Strawberry Fields Forever, probably my favorite track they've done, although I love Taxman. You Say Goodbye, I Say Hello, Hello, Goodbye. Penny Lane, another nice little McCartney one. Baby You're a Rich Man's kind of cool. All You Need Is Love is great. The guest appearances, I don't know if they list them in here, but the guest appearances on that song for the big vocal stuff, you've got Eric Clapton, you got Keith Moon, you've got, man, I'm just forgetting so many names, but anybody who seemed to be anybody back at that time was doing backing vocals on that track, so that was pretty cool. But just another classic album. And by the way, I think some of these songs were written and recorded before Sgt. Pepper's was released. So it's hard to know, was this from one exact session? I think this was all kind of done at one time. Feels really cohesive. This one is, I don't know if it's necessarily, it's not a concept album, I don't think. I mean, it just feels like a collection of songs, which is cool. But it seems like maybe some of these were written while they were kind of putting this together. And then they said, well, these don't really fit with this concept, so we'll save them. And then they wrote and recorded the rest of the album at a later time. But I Am the Walrus, just so ahead of their time. They were just inventing, they were just paving the way, they were just showing everyone how it's done. So awesome. I know a lot of people in my age group or even younger that they don't either know the Beatles that well, they don't really like them, or they don't understand them, or they just didn't grow up with them. But I grew up with them, and I never thought that I really liked them until maybe the last 10, 15 years when I was like, oh yeah, I respect them, but I don't know if I like them. And then as I started to collect the albums, I was like, these guys are obviously brilliant. Incredible. So Magical Mystery Tour, not ranking these albums, but I like a ton of my favorite songs from the Beatles come from this album for sure. Okay. Where are we now? So as if that wasn't a ton from 67, they come up with this monstrous double album, 93 minutes long, simply titled The Beatles, but we all call it the White Album. This is them just looking iconic, right? I mean, John Lennon's starting to look like Jesus, but he's not totally out of control yet. They just look... I think I would tell you this is my favorite album from them, because this is them... by the way, these were a pair. Speaking of pairs, these albums are a pair. These final ones are a pair, or you could say three. But just a massive... I guess Frank Zappa's Freak Out was a double album, but it was only like 60 minutes. This is 93 minutes. To me, this is the first massive double album, you know, before The Wall and all that stuff. Opens up with Back in the USSR, Dear Prudence, Glass Onion, Obla Di, Obla Da, Bungalow Bill, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun. Love those songs. Those are deep cuts. Martha, My Dear is great. You know, just the whole first album is great. Now, some people might say, like, it's a little long-winded. If they would have taken the best stuff and made this like 145-minute album, it would have been incredible. I don't disagree, but why not just let the Beatles experiment here? They're totally still in the experimental phase, just completely experimenting at this point. You say it's your birthday. Now here's the thing, Helter Skelter, another heavy metal tune. People talk about, you know, what were the first heavy metal songs? I'm like, Day Tripper. Helter Skelter from 68. Heavy. And then here's the weird thing. You've got Revolution 1, which is like a relaxed version of the song I grew up knowing. And you got Revolution 9, which has nothing to do with that melody. It's just completely bizarrely weird and experimental and a trip. And it's like 8 minutes long. And so that's On the second album, you get a lot of maybe the lesser catchy tracks, but you do get Revolution 1, Helter Skelter, You Say It's Your Birthday, but then you got stuff like I said, you got Revolution 9, which is strange. So I'm not saying it's a perfect album, but it's just the Beatles at their peak, just completely experimenting and giving you everything. They're throwing everything at you on this. Everything. And I really, as the prog rocker in me, just looks at this album like, wow. As if Sgt. Pepper's wasn't the biggest concept album, and as if they weren't doing tricky things on writing awesome songs on Magical Mystery Tour like Strawberry Fields Forever and Blue Jay Way and I Am the Walrus. Then they do this. Mind you, I'm still talking about how Revolver is just a ripping kind of album for them, and Rubber Soul was great, and and Further Review Help was pretty solid, but they're on this roll. They're just on a roll with these albums. I wonder, some of these albums have the Apple in the middle, and some of them have the Capitol Records in the middle. I thought everything they did at one point was just on their own label. But, here's Strawberry Fields Forever. I guess it's okay to show this now, even though it's out of sequence. So this came out in '70. No secret here, the band broke up. Look at John Lennon there. This must be at the end. He's really got the beard going there. But this is sort of a compilation, I guess. So Hey Jude and the heavy song Revolution, another metal one. They got 3 heavy metal ones at least. Day Tripper, Helter Skelter, and Revolution, not Revolution 1 or Revolution 9, but Revolution from the Hey Jude compilation. They've stuck Paperback Writer on here, which we already had on an earlier album I showed, but hey, why not? It's a great ripping song. But I think Hey Jude, Revolution, and Lady Madonna were all written as if this album was already 93 minutes and as if it was already long enough. They wrote a ripping version of Revolution, they wrote the 7-minute Hey Jude, and they wrote Lady Madonna during this session. And they didn't make it on this 93-minute album. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. Can't Buy Me Love. And then just some thrown in. Rain is actually good, and that's from the Revolver sessions along with Paperback Writer. But Old Brown Shoe, Ballad of John and Yoko, Don't Let Me Down. Some extra thrown in things here. But, just recorded. I don't know if I think they were recorded during the next album's session. But just tying into this is that they did Hey Jude and the Heavy Revolution and Lady Madonna during this same session. So, man. Everybody talks about the albums before this and the one that's going to come after this. But man, to be on a fly on the wall or to be involved in the band during this time. Wow. You probably see a lot of Yoko. I think she was involved in the band by '67. Not sure what impact that had early on, but obviously it changed things, so they say. So there you go, the White Album. Probably my favorite, but man, Revolver, and you can't argue with Sgt. Pepper's, and Magical Mystery has all the great songs, like this one. Strawberry fields, nothing is real. All right, iconic, maybe consider their best album. They have many best albums. We Know That Road. That's Abbey Road in the summertime in England. In London. There you go. John's got the long hair. He's got a suit on. They all have suits. Paul's not wearing shoes. But George is still wearing jeans. So they're all dressed up, but he's wearing jeans. These 3 are dressed up. He's not. He's really dressed up. Paul's not wearing shoes. That's probably a busy road. But hey. What a cool thing. So here we go. This is another great thing. They've got a whole medley, of just all these 1.5, 2-minute songs on the backside. but we'll get to that in a sec. I mean, you got Come Together. I grew up knowing that song, but I also grew up knowing the Aerosmith version. Something is a classic. I almost put this on in the background. It's a George Harrison one. Everybody knows that song when you hear it. Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Again, not a hit, but just really nicely done in Abbey Road Studios with George Martin. Octopus's Garden. Here's another one. I'm not saying it's like Yellow Submarine, but it's just another Ringo Starr one. Little jaunty tune. I Want You, She's So Heavy. Glass Onion. This is from... Listen to John Lennon on this album. He sounds great on this album. And they got a little bit of strings in the background. I Want You, She's So Heavy. I knew that song, but I knew that song from the thrash metal band Coroner. Had it on Mental Vortex. So I always knew that song kind of even more so through the Coroner version, if you can believe that. But that's on here. Here Comes the Sun, another great George Harrison one. So he's got 2 gems on this one. And then you got this medley. You Never Give Me Your Money, Sun King, Mean Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, Golden Slumbers, and Carry That Weight in the End. We may hear something from this if we get there, because I had to represent this album somewhere on here. And if we go all the way to the end, that thing will get cut off so that we can get something from Rubber Soul on here, because the background music's heavy on Revolver and Magical Mystery, but I wanted to get some White Album on here for sure, and I wanted to get at least something from Sgt. Pepper's, and man, if I can get... You can't do a show and not get something from Abbey Road on there, and if we go long enough, I'll sneak in something from Rubber Soul. So there you go. Okay, so this is a classic album. This is basically their last album. Last time the 4 of them got in the studio together. It was great. 69. So late 69, John Lennon's out of the band, but they don't tell the public. So the Beatles put out their final album, Let It Be. And it is an album, but it's not... They had an album run of 6 in a row. This is where I don't feel like I think it's got moments for sure. But it's disjointed, and it's got stuff from different sessions, I guess. Maybe from the White Album session, maybe from the Abbey Road sessions, maybe just leftover things. But, Across the Universe is nice. The Long and Winding Road is just a beautiful song, and the title track, Let It Be, is great. So Long and Winding Road and Let It Be are just absolute classics. So even though I'm not putting this on a pedestal quite as high as the previous 6 albums, it's understandable. The band was breaking up, and they tried to put this out as kind of a send-off for the fans. Get back to where you once belonged. They were trying to get back to just rock it out. They were kind of, I think at this point, trying to go, okay, we've been experimental and creative and clever. Let's strip it back. I think Get Back was that attempt. Across the Universe is good. But yeah, it's still got classic stuff on it. It's just a little more hit and miss for me. Whereas these albums are just perfect, and this one's just awesome because there's so much. And these are just great. And I think we showed you, Rubber Soul and Revolver, incredible. And by the way, I think even though these all have their own things, these are a pair, and definitely because these came from similar sessions, you could say it's a trio. But man, what a career! And I think I showed this earlier, but this is one of the great compilations of all time. If you don't know where to start with the Beatles, and you think the early 60s stuff is too 60s, snag this. It's got all kinds of good stuff on there. Yeah, I grew up on all this stuff. These two, so I heard pretty much a nice overview of the whole band. And by the way, Please Please Me, the first album, this is basically the cover. It's got different framing and font, and it may be a slightly different picture, but it's basically that. And then you flip it over, and that's them in the same location. I don't know, is that 1969? I'm looking at John Lennon's beard thinking it's 69. And that's this cover, and then you flip this over and you're back to the beginning. So it's a really cool way that they did that. Also, I thought this was a proper album forever. My dad had it. I just thought it was like their final album. after Let It Be, but it's really just a compilation of cool stuff here too. Yeah, my dad had all this stuff. In fact, he had even more, and I guess I don't know what happened to it, but I'm pretty sure he had A Hard Day's Night and, you know, with the Beatles, all those albums. Finally, we get to Abbey Road. Finally. And also that means that we're kind of running short on time here, but I'm going to try and stretch this out long enough to get, this song's going to cut abruptly, and we're going to get something from Rubber Soul just for a split second. But that is just covering, this is finishing off the Radio Giants series, and I wanted to go out with a bang. So kind of when I was starting this off early in the year, I think by March or April, I was like, okay, we're going to head towards, I think I did Queen in October, Led Zeppelin in November, and the Beatles here in December. I'm just going out with a bang. And I'm glad I got to review these guys because I grew up on them, and then for the longest time I was like, I'm not a fan, and then I was like, well, I respect them, and then it started 10, 12, 15 years ago. I started collecting their albums and going, especially like the White Album and Abbey Road and the later stuff, going, these guys are good. They've got good stuff on here, for sure. And then just going through it and going, you know, I had this idea in my head that if it's before 67, it's probably just too corny and too 60s, but man, Revolver's great. Rubber Soul's really great too. And I found stuff on Help, you know. And then you just keep going back and you find stuff, even on the earliest albums, you find stuff, or you just can see why it was exciting at that time. But so some people say they had 13 albums. I'm just going to say they had 12. They had this Yellow Submarine album, but it was really just borrowing tracks from the past and doing orchestration and a couple of new songs. It cuts. I was going to go into the end, but here's Norwegian Wood, George Harrison from Rubber Soul, to finish it. So we got all music from all the big six. I call them the six in a row. Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, Magical Mystery, White Album, Abbey Road. Some people would say Let It Be. Some people would add Help, and that's 8 in a row. Some people would go Hard Day's Night. Just keep going, because it's the Beatles. So there you have it. That concludes the Radio Giants series. We go out with the biggest band on the planet thus far. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.